Okay, welcome back. To those of you who are in my art history or art appreciation classes, it's been a little bit of a break because we just had a week where we took our midterm, so part of the week was devoted to prepping for it, and that's true both for the online class as well as the regular class. So we're on to Unit 7, and make sure to have watched the art historical videos that precede this video, and that would be the series of videos, the lecture on the end of the Baroque and then through the Age of Enlightenment and the classical period leading up to Romanticism. And so, because that kind of sets the tone for why I'm going to be talking about the different things I'm talking about in terms of which art medium and other stuff. So the art media that we're going to be talking about for this unit is printmaking, and as you can probably tell from the way the first page is organized, the information is going to be pretty much organized around the different types of printmaking, organizing them into categories, and explaining each of those different types of printmaking in terms of the actual physical way that they are made. And the reason why we're talking about printmaking here is because by the time we get to the 16th and 17th century, printmaking becomes a hugely important part of art making in Europe and in the Western art. And a lot of artists pretty much make a living through their printmaking, and so it allows for kind of an explosion of art and also an explosion of being able for people to be able to see some copies of art. So people may not be able to see all the paintings that are made across Europe. They may not see all the paintings that are made in Italy or in France if they're living in Germany or England, but they can sometimes they can see print copies of those works, and so it becomes a pretty important part about the history of art. So that's one of the reasons why we're talking about it. Like I said, the lecture is organized very much breaking down the different types of the media, but I want to just take a moment to discuss a little bit of art historical information to give you some context. The very earliest types of prints at all would be probably cylinder seals that we see going back to ancient Sumeria. They're not prints in that they're not using ink, but they are print impressions where small sculptural objects that are carved and are cylinders round are then rolled into clay and they make impressions. We've already seen this idea to a degree when we talked about different types of relief sculpture. We talked about counter relief and how that's used in signet rings and signet seals. So that's quite old, going back as 3000 BCE. And then in terms of ink prints, we have evidence that the ancient Egyptians made prints onto fabric, like for decorative patterns on fabric. And we have evidence at around 6th or 7th century BCE that Egyptians were doing that. But in terms of prints on paper, the oldest, there's a bit of a debate whether it's maybe 5th century CE or 6th or 7th century CE in China. There's a little bit of a debate as to whether some of those earliest ones are truly rubbings or whether they are hand burnished prints. But we definitely see by the Tang Dynasty in China, we see kind of an explosion of relief printmaking, and most of it done by hand burnishing rather than where hand burnishing is where you kind of you press the ink into the paper by hand rather than through the force of a printing press. And then we see that tradition and technology transfer to Japan, where also relief printmaking using wood blocks. And so about the 9th century in Japan, we see I think the 9th century Japan, we have the very first dated print. And then it took a long time for printmaking to really take off and over in Europe. But one of the major things that happened was in the 15th century, we had the invention of the printing press. And with the invention of the printing press, then it was much more useful to actually have images printed If you have already letters to print on a book, if you already can print text, it's nice to have images that go with them. So the structure of this lecture, as I said, is primarily going to be about the different types of printmaking, and it's going to be roughly in the order that that we see them come up through history. So we're going to start with relief printmaking, and then intaglio, and then planographic, and finally silkscreen and stencil. Under relief, we're going to be primarily just talking about woodcut. Under intaglio, we'll talk about more than what's listed right here, which is we'll be talking about etching and engraving, but also mezzotint and aquatint. Under planographic, we're only really going to be talking about lithography. And as you can kind of see from these diagrams, they give you a quick visualization of how they're different. Probably the most important thing to understand is the difference between relief and intaglio, because they're kind of the opposite. In relief, the carving away is where the ink isn't, and then the areas that are not carved hold the ink. And intaglio, it's the opposite. The areas that are carved away or carved into are the things that hold the ink. And we will talk about each of these, explain them a little bit more in a little bit more complexity as we go. So let's start with relief printmaking. Relief printmaking can be quite simple, such as this Albrecht Dürer relief print, where it's just a single ink color, and so as you can see, everywhere that's been carved away comes out pure white, and everywhere that he left the wood raised up, when it's inked, that holds that ink, and that makes that print. The basic nature of relief printmaking is that you carve away everywhere that's going to be light, and you leave the flat, and then you roll ink across the top of it. And then those flat areas that are not carved away take up the ink. Now, this is here, Great Wave by Hokusai is an example, like a number of these, of Japanese woodblock prints where it's multiple colors. Some of the colors are done in gradations. It's extremely complex. Sometimes as many as 30 different blocks are used to make an image such as this. But it is really the same technique as this. So one of the artists that we're going to be seeing a lot of in this lecture is Albrecht Dürer, and he was a master of relief printmaking, but he was a master of many of the printmaking processes, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to see a lot of his work. But here's another example of relief printmaking, and as you can see, with relief printmaking, you have a very kind of specific kind of look to it, because every line is a carved line, and it gives it a specific kind of texture and a specific type of contrast. They tend to be very high contrasty images, especially in the West. All right, I'm going to end there, and then we'll get to